We are in the midst of an unprecedented battle, where our very fundamental rights are under relentless assault, and the alarming truth is, many remain blissfully unaware. We are acutely aware of the significant impact that alternative media outlets, like our own, have had on thwarting the globalists' objectives during their recent major endeavor, the plandemic and the quote-unquote vaccine rollout. Furthermore, we recognize that more formidable challenges lie ahead, surpassing the scale of the preceding crisis. Anticipated events include another plandemic, additional quote-unquote vaccine initiatives, the impending risk of a cyber pandemic, the ongoing promotion of the climate change agenda, and the imminent introduction of central bank digital currencies. In order to encounter minimal resistance during their impending large-scale crises, the globalists are actively pursuing a strategy to control the dissemination of information. This endeavor precisely characterizes their current actions. Their current focus is on curtailing freedom of speech, and the consequences for humanity could be catastrophic. National legislations have already been set in motion, and there are strong indications that international regulations will follow suit in the coming year. A new treaty with the United Nations subsidiary, the World Health Organization, could potentially grant them expanded powers for global censorship. The year 2022 marked a turning point for freedom of speech. The European Union's Digital Services Act, DSA, which came into effect on the 16th of November 2022, imposed strict regulations on very large online platforms, VLOPs, with more than 45 million monthly active users. Platforms such as Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram were now required to swiftly remove illegal content, hate speech, and disinformation under the threat of hefty fines. This enforcement of content regulation not only impacted Europe, but set a precedent that could extend globally. The European Union has emerged as a global regulatory superpower, dictating how companies worldwide must behave to operate within Europe, the world's second-largest market. Its regulatory standards often become the global standard, a phenomenon known as the quote-unquote Brussels effect. The General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, implemented in May 2018, exemplifies this global influence. GDPR's privacy laws, including explicit consent for data processing, have become the standard worldwide. With the DSA, the EU aims to secure a similar global adoption of its content regulation standards. While the EU's enforcement of GDPR has been somewhat limited, the DSA possesses significant enforcement capabilities. The European Commission is bolstering its internal industry watchdog, expecting to have over 100 full-time staff by 2024. Additionally, contract workers and national experts will supervise the operations of big tech platforms. The cost of this enforcement operation will be borne by the VLOPs themselves, contributing up to 0.05% of their global annual turnover to the Commission. This significant investment demonstrates the EU's commitment to enforcing its content regulations. It amounts to what EU Internal Markets Commissioner Thierry Breton calls a quote-unquote historic moment in digital regulation. The regulation of the DSA falls under the purview of the European Commission, rather than an independent regulator. This concentration of power raises concerns about democratic accountability. Moreover, the DSA includes a crisis management mechanism, granting the Commission the authority to direct how platforms respond to events such as the Russian invasion of Ukraine. The Commission's definition of a quote-unquote crisis and its potential for abuse is worrisome, considering the EU's previous use of the quote-unquote rule of law against ideological opponents. The DSA not only grants the EU immense powers for censorship, but also represents a profound technocratic evasion of democratic accountability. The unelected European Commission compels big tech to police the internet and impose its values on users without being accountable to the millions of ordinary European citizens. If such draconian censorship were enforced by a national government, citizens could express their dissent through voting. However, this scenario presents a different challenge, as the EU's technocratic power is being outsourced to big tech, evading democratic checks and balances. Big tech companies find themselves at a crossroads, compelled to comply with the DSA regulations to maintain operation in Europe. Even outspoken figures like Elon Musk, who once championed minimal censorship and maximal free expression on platforms like Twitter, now align themselves with the goals of transparency, accountability, and accuracy of information set forth by the EU. The EU's influence has been so significant that it is now instructing Twitter to increase content moderation staff instead of relying solely on algorithmic moderation. What is most shocking about this scenario is the lack of accountability and anti-democratic nature exhibited by all parties involved. The European Commission justifies its censorship laws as protection against the quote-unquote harm caused by unregulated social media companies, while big tech complies with these laws to serve its user base. However, neither the Commission nor big tech is genuinely accountable to the public they claim to protect or serve. This lack of accountability undermines the principles of democracy and diminishes the voice of ordinary citizens. The EU's censorship regime, as established by the DSA, has far-reaching consequences beyond Europe. By opening an office in Silicon Valley, the EU aims to forge closer relationships between its regulators and big tech. The United States, under President Biden, has expressed intentions to follow suit and implement measures to regulate big tech. The DSA has set a precedent for the regulation of online content, and its adoption globally has become increasingly likely. Regrettably, the concerning reality is that despite awareness of these developments, there seems to be a lack of substantial collective action to counter these emerging challenges. In light of these pressing concerns, it is incumbent upon us, as individuals and as a collective, to take action. We have seen the power of alternative media in shaping the narrative and resisting the encroachment on freedom of speech. As we brace for even greater challenges, our vigilance and activism must intensify. Here is how you can contribute to this crucial effort. 1. Stay informed. Continue to educate yourself about the evolving landscape of online regulation and censorship. Knowledge is a powerful tool in navigating these complex issues. 2. Engage. Join or support organizations and initiatives that champion digital freedom and civil liberties. Be part of the conversation and advocate for a free and open internet. 3. Spread awareness. Share information about these challenges with friends, family, and colleagues. Encourage open dialogue and critical thinking about the consequences of increasing online censorship. 4. Support alternative platforms. Explore and support alternative online platforms that prioritize free speech and respect for individual privacy. These platforms offer alternatives to mainstream social media. 5. Stay united. In times of adversity, unity is our greatest strength. Collaborate with like-minded individuals and organizations to amplify your voice and advocate for a free and open digital world. Remember, the future of the Internet and the preservation of democratic principles in the digital age depend on our collective efforts. It is time to act decisively and protect the values of freedom, transparency, and accountability that underpin a healthy society and a thriving Internet.
Well, did Europe just take a big step to eliminate personal freedoms and free speech with the passage and the now enforcement of the Digital Services Act? European Union Commissioner Thierry Breton says this will strengthen democracy by protecting you from dangerous online content. Listen.
Today, the Digital Services Act, the so-called DSA, becomes legally enforceable for very large online platforms and search engines. These systemic platforms play a very, very important role on our daily life. And it is really the time now for Europe, for us, to set our own rules. The DSA is here to protect free speech against arbitrary decisions, and at the same time, to protect our citizens and democracies against illegal content.
Well, David Thunder is our next guest, and he says this is an attack on free speech and liberty. David is a researcher and lecturer in political philosophy and joins us now. David, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Clayton. Great to be here.
So, David, can you explain to our audience exactly what the Digital Services Act is, and now it is fully enforceable by the European Commission?
Sure. The Digital Services Act is a law that has been introduced by the European Union. And basically, the goal of this law is to update current regulations of the European Union of online content, the regulation specifically of illegal content such as misinformation, disinformation, hate speech, and child pornography, and those kinds of issues. So that's basically the goal of the legislation, is to clamp down on illegal content on the internet.
And who gets to decide what is illegal content? What is the governing body that's going to be sitting in a room deciding what content is safe for us and is legal?
Well, the jurisdiction or the competent authorities will be divided between the European Commission and those that it nominates on one hand, and the national member states, the member states of the European Union on the other. It'll be a divided authority. Personally, I find this to be very worrying because it puts in law, in European law, the principle that very vague categories such as disinformation and hate speech that are notoriously vulnerable to politicization will effectively be enforced at the Europe-wide level through an army of fact-checkers that are endorsed and legitimated by the European Commission. So basically, we're handing our freedom of expression to a European bureaucracy to basically, what they could do is they can contact a service provider or an online platform, and they can flag up content that they consider to be illegal. Once they flag that, then the service provider or the platform is obligated in law to take down that content.
Wow.
Right? So that has huge implications for freedom of expression, because essentially petty bureaucrats who are running these fact-checking organizations will be deciding in conjunction with the European Commission what counts as acceptable and unacceptable speech on the internet. And of course, the issue is, as we've seen over the last few years, concepts like disinformation can be very easily interpreted to advance a particular political vision of reality. So we saw, for example, the lab leak theory or a hypothesis about the virus, about the coronavirus, that was clamped down on by Facebook, right, based on the idea that it was disinformation or misinformation. And later on, now it's almost a consensus position among many experts that in fact the lab leak theory is extremely plausible and probable. So that was one example. Another example was the vaccines that we saw, okay, with vaccine efficacy. Anyone who questioned whether vaccines could block transmission, a lot of them were clamped down on as purveyors of disinformation. And of course, it turned out that the COVID vaccines failed to stop transmission. And one of the most notorious examples is their enthusiastic advocacy of lockdowns, which we're now seeing have created devastating effects in society that will be suffering for generations. Hallelujah. Including educational deficits for young people, psychological trauma from isolation and loneliness, untreated illnesses, and the list goes on. And I could go on and cite lots of other examples of things that were considered disinformation at the time by official sources. And later on, science moved on, and, suddenly we realized that these were actually, these were true. They were not disinformation. So politicians, public officials, political organizations, people in power will use these categories to advance their own narratives. And the net effect of this kind of act, this Digital Services Act, is to empower a bureaucracy to go around protecting the official narrative that is favored by the European Union, the European Commission, on issues like the Ukraine war with Russia, issues like any kind of future pandemic, and issues like, transgender ideology and politics. All of these issues, instead of being just fought out in the public sphere in a democratic manner, we're going to have basically an army of bureaucrats, of fact checkers, telling us what the correct position is in advance.
I mean, it sounds like a Trojan horse plan to really, to stick these bureaucrats into every faction of our online and digital lives, from digital surveillance, of digital, ID systems being set up, going cashless, removing us from any sort of a cash-based society, make sure everything is being monitored and watched at all times by the. And it's terrifying. And if you think about the largest purveyors of misinformation during COVID, during the Ukraine war, have been the official narratives. The biggest purveyors of propaganda, the biggest liars, as Senator Rand Paul in the United States has said, the biggest liars are the United States government. They're the biggest perpetrators of propaganda. So they are going to be the purveyors of truth?
Yes, I agree that, in a sense, this particular Digital Services Act is a Trojan horse, in the sense that it's dressed up in the language of, we want to go against child pornography. We want to make sure that information is kind of responsibly used, and we want more transparency and so on. But in reality, as I said, essentially what it does is it puts ordinary users of Twitter and Facebook at the mercy of faceless bureaucrats, not only in the social media companies now, but also in a government organization that can then instruct the social media companies. And by the way, they have enormous enforcement powers, because they can fine social media companies up to 6% of their annual turnover, annual global turnover, for failing to comply with their policies or not taking sufficient action against, disinformation or hate speech and so on. So I think that we are facing a really dystopian, possibly dystopian future in the European Union regarding, freedom of expression. But now they also have a clause in there that says that they can declare an emergency, and in the event of declaring an emergency, then they can basically instruct these platforms to censor any kind of information that might be deemed a threat to public order, or it might be deemed a public threat. Article 11 of the European Charter of Fundamental Rights, which is on freedom of expression, says that European citizens have the right to receive and impart information without interference by public authorities. So that remains in place. So I think we may be facing a legal battle very soon, and hopefully there will be these bureaucrats, unelected bureaucrats, will be taken to account for this really draconian assault on freedom of expression. Overall, it's clear that any citizen who cares about freedom of expression, freedom of speech, and indeed the future of a free way of life should be very, very, very concerned about the Digital Services Act.
As trust in institutions continues to decline, countries around the world are rushing to control the flow of information before their citizens completely lose confidence in their governments. Over the last 2 years, many governments have proposed bills which would result in an unprecedented amount of online censorship. In some countries, these bills have already been passed. European authorities separated their online censorship efforts into 2 separate bills: the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act. Both were introduced in December 2020. Now, it's important to note that the Digital Markets Act and the Digital Services Act are 2 of 5 bills which make up the EU's Digital Services Package. The Digital Services Package is the second phase of the EU's digital agenda, which, like many so-called agendas these days, is set to be complete by 2030. The EU's Digital Markets Act and Digital Services Act were both passed in the spring of 2022. Both went into force in the autumn of 2022, but won't be enforced until later this year and early next year, depending on the size of the relevant entity. The same is true for the EU's Data Governance Act, which was passed last summer and goes into force this autumn. The EU is also in the process of passing the Data Act. Both bills are outside the scope of this video, but the main takeaway is the mandatory sharing of data with governments and corporations. Now, the fifth and final bill in the EU's digital services package is the Artificial Intelligence Regulation Act, which will be discussed later this year. The EU's AI regulation is reportedly the first of its kind. Note that all 5 bills are regulations, meaning they will override the national laws of EU countries. Sounds democratic. That's because it will establish a Ministry of Truth in every EU country, which will censor certain information and push government propaganda. I'm not exaggerating. Each country will have a deceptively titled, quote, Digital Services Coordinator, which will function as a Ministry of Truth. Each Digital Services Coordinator will appoint, quote, trusted flaggers to monitor and take down content. Trusted flaggers will be law enforcement, NGOs, and other unelected institutions. As you might have guessed, trusted flaggers will have to submit reports to their respective digital services coordinators. This information will also be forwarded to the European Board for Digital Services, which consists of digital services coordinators from each country. Regarding the kind of content that trusted flaggers will track and take down, the scope seems to be limited to illegal content, as in the UK. However, the bill suggests disinformation could be on their radar as well. Now, this begs the question of who defines disinformation, and the answer is probably the EU. Similarly to the UK, violators of the EU's upcoming regulations will face fines of up to 6% of their annual income per infraction, and repeated offenders will be banned. But wait, there's more. The bill explicitly states that in the event of a crisis, the European Board for Digital Services will instruct social media platforms to enhance content moderation, change their terms and conditions, work closer with trusted flaggers, and tweak the algorithm to, quote, promote trusted information. In other words, the next time there's a crisis, the government narrative will be promoted and opposing ideas and positions will be downranked or deleted. The best part is that there's no limit on how long these emergency social media measures would last. As they say, never let a good crisis go to waste. Now, for your information, the Digital Services Act specifies that a crisis includes, quote, armed conflicts or acts of terrorism, including emerging conflicts or acts of terrorism, natural disasters such as earthquakes and hurricanes, as well as from pandemics and other serious cross-border threats to public health. All I can think of is how weather modification is somehow left out of discussions about extreme weather events, even though 50 countries are actively modifying the weather. Now, I don't imagine this topic will be allowed at all when such a crisis occurs, so consider learning about it using the link in the description. Now, not surprisingly, the WEF is a very big fan of the EU's Digital Services Act and claims that it will be used as the standard for online censorship around the world once its success is seen by other countries. Now, it's safe to say that the EU's totalitarian approach has failed so far. Trust in EU governments fell by almost 25% during the pandemic, and that's the average drop. Many EU countries saw even larger drops in trust. The Czech Republic leads the pack, with just 15% of Czechs now trusting their government. Whereas the Digital Markets Act was clearly created to make Europe's technology sector more competitive, the Digital Services Act was clearly created to control European citizens. After all, the last thing the EU wants is for people to lose trust in it, but these laws will only accelerate that process. I'm not religious, folks, but I'm honestly thanking God for decentralized social media right now.
And welcome back to Compass with me, Basil Valentine. United Kingdom peers have passed a controversial new law aimed at making social media firms more responsible for users' safety on their platforms. The so-called Online Safety Bill has taken years to agree and will force firms to remove illegal content and protect children from some legal but apparently harmful material. But critics argue it will allow a regulator and tech firms to dictate what may and may not be said online. New offences introduced include cyber flashing and the sharing of deep-fake pornography. But lawyer Graham Smith has said the bill, while it has well-meaning aims, in the end contains much that is problematic. If the road to hell is paved with good intentions, this is a motorway, he said to the BBC. Joining me now to discuss the new bill is investigative journalist and TNT contributor Ian Davis. Welcome to the programme, Ian.
Oh, thank you very much for having me, Basil. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Great. 300 pages, this bill, so, you know, as usual, extremely verbose, and I can't help thinking it's yet another example of the awful legislation that's been introduced by successive governments in the UK over the last 25 years.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's kind of following that American model, isn't it, of just kind of an impenetrable piece of legislation that yes, you know, even legal scholars have struggled to understand. So yes, I think it's highly likely that a significant proportion of the parliamentarians that have enabled this legislation to go through probably don't understand it very well. It's either that they either don't understand it very well, or if they do, they don't care one iota about democratic principles, because this is an utterly anti-democratic piece of legislation. Anybody that kind of is familiar with you know, the principles of democracy, what we might call democratic values, the freedom of speech, freedom of expression, which are cornerstones of our society and supposedly the thing that our society is based upon, this legislation is utterly anti-democratic. It's dictatorial.
Bill supposedly protects against child sexual abuse, extreme sexual violence, illegal immigration and people smuggling, promoting or facilitating suicide, promoting self-harm, animal cruelty, terrorism, and selling illegal drugs or weapons. Surely that's a positive list of things to see excluded from the internet.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, and that's how this kind of legislation is sold to the public, and I suggest probably to quite a few parliamentarians. But this legislation doesn't achieve any of those aims. I mean, for example, people don't buy and sell drugs and buy and sell weapons using Facebook. They do it on the dark web. People, I mean, one of the things that they could have done if they were serious about protecting children online is compel Facebook to remove their dark web gateway, because you can access Facebook. Facebook has got a dark web website. So paedophiles who are going on there masquerading probably as, you know, somebody else, and probably using a VPN, the masking their IP address, they'll be accessing Facebook through the dark web. So this legislation does nothing. In fact, it comes to the very question about the idea of legislation being able to curtail criminal activity, because by nature, criminals don't really care about legislation. If they did, they wouldn't be criminals. So, very good point, yeah. So it's kind of nonsense, really. One of the other things, I mean, they're saying about it protecting children. How does this legislation protect children? Because adults that are perhaps predatory adults that are using things like TikTok and things like that to potentially groom children. But they're not doing that by logging in, using their own names and using their own identities. So this isn't going to stop people from doing that kind of activity because, as I said earlier, by nature, they don't care what the rules and regulations are. What they're doing is inherently illegal. And another point is the police have got, and we already have in this country, laws, and the police have got the technology, and certainly through places like the Cybersecurity Centre, have got the ability to track down paedophiles that are abusing children online. And we see a large number of cases where the police are able to do that. They're able to prosecute people that are doing this kind of activity online. The police's problem and the investigators' problem and the authorities' problems in that regard are resources. They don't have sufficient resources to even scratch the surface of the scale of this problem. And this legislation does nothing to address that resource problem. I mean, the idea that it's for protecting children or tackling terrorism content. I mean, for a start, if you wanted to do that, perhaps you could remove some of the BBC videos that are on YouTube eulogizing about outlawed terrorist organizations like AJS and terrorist organizations like that, which are still videos that you can watch on YouTube. So, perhaps they should do something about that. But of course, this legislation isn't designed to that. In fact, this legislation is designed to protect the BBC so that they can continue to promote outlawed prescribed terrorist groups, which they have done frequently in the past. What this is about curtailing and attacking freedom of speech. It's as pure and simple as that. So the idea is that Ofcom is set up at the regulator, and it will impose a duty upon what they're calling the Category 1 services, so the big social media platforms. And that is quote, a duty to include provisions in the terms of service specifying in relation to each kind of priority content that is harmful to adults, that is to be treated in a way described in subsection 4. So we have this concept of harmful content that is harmful to adults. This legislation means that those service providers like Facebook, they have to have the ability to do these 4 things that are described in subsection 4. So 1, take down the content. 2, restrict users' access to the content. 3, limiting the recommendations and promotion of the content. 4, disabling, effectively recommending or promoting the content. And this is going to be done through secondary legislation as well. So parliamentarians have passed this piece of legislation and put it into law without really knowing what it is that is going to be deemed harmful. There's nothing in the legislation that says what is or what isn't harmful, but we can certainly figure out quite easily what is going to be deemed harmful. For example, questioning vaccines. That will undoubtedly be deemed harmful. So what this legislation says is that social media companies will have to have mechanisms in place to take down that content, to restrict access to that content, to limit any recommendations or any promotion of that content. So this is undoubtedly a mechanism by which the government, using secondary legislation, will specify what Ofcom will deem to be acceptable speech online. That is what this legislation is about. This is what this legislation has always been about. The idea that it is about protecting children is laughable. It's not true, and it was just a selling point to convince people to go along with what is actually the end of online freedom of speech in the UK.
Well, obviously, I hope you're wrong, Ian, and a lot of this will have to be tested in a court of law. For example, you mentioned the vaccines. Surely somebody will go to court and say it is not harmful to say that the vaccines are not effective and are causing injuries and deaths. And it will ultimately come down to a judge, possibly even ending up in the United Kingdom Supreme Court.
Yes, let's certainly hope that that is the case. The problem with it is that this legislation puts the onus not through any legal mechanism, but through the regulations of terms of service by private corporations. So you can certainly hope that these cases will come to court and people will challenge it. But what they will actually be challenging are the terms of service of a private organisation. So I think that's going to be quite difficult to challenge in a court of law, because Meta can say, well, you know, there are terms of service. You don't have to use our platform, will be the argument that will be made. And that's the slopey shouldered nature of this legislation as well. So the regulator will define terms of service, which, you know, social media companies will be required under this legislation to have terms of service for UK users, which may be different from their terms of service for American users or Brazilian users or French users. So it might even be you know, nation specific, but nonetheless, it won't be a law. It will be the private terms of service of a private corporation. So I think that's going to be very difficult to challenge in a court of law. This is very insidious, this legislation. It's designed to be slippery. There are no definitions in it. So what is harmful? Well, there are no definitions of even what constitutes harm. That isn't even broached in this legislation. It just uses these terms willy-nilly, which no parliamentarian has made any effort to scrutinise it. It's just Parliament is, you know, in my view, Parliament's a completely useless institution. But I mean, that's, you know, my personal view. But nonetheless, Parliament has allowed this legislation to go through without really knowing, you know, what it's about. The most important thing for people to understand is the nature of the regulations are not defined in the legislation. They will be defined subsequently through secondary legislation, which will be at the behest of the Secretary of State. This is unbelievable. And I think, sadly, as is often the case with this kind of thing, people aren't going to notice until it starts impacting them. And even then they may not notice. So because this legislation doesn't stop you or I posting whatever we want. We can post whatever we want on, for example, Facebook or Twitter or whatever we want. It's just that what it does stipulate is that it puts an onus on a private corporation, not the government, on a private corporation to ensure that nobody sees that information. That's right. What this is about. Even if you said in a court of law, my free speech has been infringed, they will say, well, no, it hasn't been infringed. You can post whatever you like. One of the chief executive officers at Twitter that says, you have a right to say whatever you want, but you don't necessarily have a right to be heard. Yes. And that's how this is designed to operate. That's how it was always designed to operate. So it's not good. This legislation is very, very bad.
I couldn't agree with you more there. The regulator on its own has supreme power, and it is effectively just an arm of government, and that therefore we are living in a form of authoritarian dictatorship. I mean, supposedly an elected dictatorship, because we get a plebiscite every 5 years, but you know, there's no moderating hand on the regulator representing the general public or any other body of opinion. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct. And also, I mean, the idea that Ofcom is independent of the government is farcical. Ofcom is established by the government. It's been set up as a regulator by the government. If you look at the board, who sits on the board of Ofcom, it's people that have had, you know, many people with former government roles that sit in on the board. You know, the board is also controlled by a lot of people that are from big tech and from industries such as the pharmaceutical industries. Ofcom is set up, is regulated by the government. It is partly funded by the government. It is beholding to the government. Part of its terms of Ofcom's terms of service is that it has to report to the government. So the idea that Ofcom is independent of the government is just ludicrous. I know that that's what Ofcom says, but it's just not true.
The nub of the problem here is this term harm, really, and what is harmful content, because it sounds like it could incorporate ultimately any sort of dissenting opinion to the government narrative, not just on COVID and vaccines, but, you know, somewhere down the line, people could claim that our conversation now, Ian, is harmful because it is putting ideas in people's heads to question their government and government authority. So what it really does is it crosses a Rubicon into a new age where the government can decide, well, can even define some of the most basic words in our lexicon.
Yes, it's totally subjective. I mean, that's the point of why they've left these terms undefined, so that they can be subsequently defined. And as you rightly say, anything can be deemed harmful. If we look at parallel other legislation that's gone through, the recent, I've never remember the name of it, the Criminal Conduct Act, which basically empowers the government and its agents to break the law with impunity. We've got further protection for national security legislation going through, which broadens the definition of national security to encompass everything. So, I mean, public health, that's a matter of national security. Yeah, everything becomes a matter of national security. So in the legislation, if something is deemed to be harmful to national security, that too is going to be, well, you won't be able to speak about it. This is the clever, probably the most duplicitous aspect of this legislation, is that you will still be able to speak your mind, but the private corporations' terms of service will be under a duty not to share anything which the government considers to be harmful. So you can say whatever you like, but no one has a right to hear it. That ultimately means then what the government defines as harmful has to be challenged in court, and that's why we have an independent judiciary, isn't it? Well, theoretically, yeah. I am very black-pilled on this issue, I have to say. You know, yes, of course we do. There are good people sitting on benches all over the country, but I would suggest that if you look to the higher courts, then you know, they're controlled as much as, you know, I mean, I don't think that we can expect a lot of justice. I often say to people, there's no justice, there's just us. It's, you know, we are in a dangerous period in our history. I think we need to be fully cognizant of that. This is extremely authoritarian, what is rolling down the road towards us at the moment. And of course, it always uses this term safety as cover for authoritarianism. We had it during the COVID farrago. We all had to be safe. That's why we had to give up civil liberties. And it's doublespeak of the worst kind, Ian. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, it's terrible. Thank you so much for joining me, Ian Davis. And just tell us quickly where we can find your work. Yeah, thanks, Basil. Yeah, you can find me at my website, which is my name spelt with two I's, IAIN Davis.com, IanDavis.com. Thank you very much indeed, Ian, and we'll speak to you again very soon.
The RESTRICT Act, which stands for Restricting the Emergence of Security Threats That Risk Information Communications Technology Act, which would allow the federal government to potentially ban technology from countries the U.S. considers to be adversaries, including China.
The bill has co-sponsors of both parties and is supported by the Biden administration.
The RESTRICT Act, the anti-TikTok law, is an Orwellian nightmare that would seize web domains and imprison Americans for up to 20 years if they contradict the regime in power. This would be the end of freedom in America, end of freedom to speak, end of freedom to think, to dissent, to function as a business, to engage in banking, e-commerce, cryptocurrency transactions, all of it would all be criminalized, and you could face up to 20 years in prison for engaging in any of those activities if the government disagrees with what you're saying or doing. Anytime the government promises to make you safer, beware of their intentions. The media amplified hysteria over TikTok, a video social media platform built and run by communist China, has handed the power opportunists in Washington, D.C. a cover story to try to control all online speech through the introduction of the S-686 Restrict Act, sponsored by an anti-free speech zealot on the left, Senator Mark Warner. The bill, introduced on March 7, 2023, uses TikTok's popularity as an excuse to criminalize American-run websites, platforms, and blogs that merely disagree with the government regime on literally any topic: vaccines, Russia, elections, bank runs, currency, transgenderism, climate change, and so on. The weaponization potential of the bill is unlimited, as it can be applied to anything that's merely deemed to be in the, quote, national security interest of the United States. The bill text explicitly states that the government may enforce, quote, any mitigation measure against any person or any property by merely deciding that an article, video, podcast, platform, or other content item contains content that they don't like. This is not a law that targets Chinese communists or TikTok. It's a law targeting Americans and threatening them with prison time if they say anything the current regime in power doesn't like. Under the proposed law, any content that the regime decides poses an undue risk to the safety of United States persons can be removed by any means necessary, including domain seizures by the DHS or other forms of sabotage, i.e. mitigation, which might include the government firebombing data centers or assassinating Americans. To annihilate all Christian content on the web, the Biden regime can simply declare that Bible scripture compromises the safety of the trans community and therefore must be removed by any means necessary. We could literally see the U.S. government burning down churches to destroy web hosting data centers that are held there. The U.S. government has been running sabotage operations against food and energy infrastructure for at least the last 2 years, so this isn't a stretch at all. Those merely deemed in violation of the Restrict Act, utterly without any court hearings or opportunity for a legal defense, may have all their assets, properties, computers, websites, servers, bank accounts, databases, and other items confiscated at gunpoint by the government with zero recourse or due process. Even worse, the Act specifically prohibits FOIA requests, that's Freedom of Information Act, from being honored in order to make sure the tyrannical government can keep the list of Resist Act targets a secret. What the U.S. government did to Julian Assange, they're about to do to millions of American citizens, perhaps even you. From the bill text itself, the Restrict Act grants authority to seize or mitigate, i.e. destroy or sabotage, all the following. This is from the bill: internet hosting services, cloud-based or distributed computing and data storage, machine learning, predictive analysis, data science products and services, including those involving the provision of services to assist a party to utilize, manage, or maintain open source software. See, this is an attack on the open source community as well. Managed services and content delivery services. This would, of course, include all websites, including all e-commerce sites. Thus, if you sell anything the government doesn't like, they can confiscate all your bank accounts, web domain, company servers, product inventory, and anything else they deem to be related. In addition, the Restrict Act threatens total government control over cryptocurrency and other vast technologies such as quantum cryptography, which is a promising tech that could allow private individuals to prevent corrupt governments from spying on their private messages. To ban all Bitcoin, the government would merely need to claim that somebody in Russia or China used Bitcoin to carry out some horrible false flag terrorism in the United States, and that Bitcoin enabled the funding for the attack. With one declaration, Bitcoin could be outlawed across the country, and anyone who transacts in Bitcoin could face 20 years in prison, plus total confiscation of all their wallets, computers, bank accounts, house, etc. It's not just crypto either that's threatened by this insane power grab. Proving that this bill isn't limited to TikTok, here are all the tech sectors that are named in the bill, which would be controlled, censored, or otherwise lorded over by the tyrannical U.S. government. Artificial intelligence and machine learning, quantum key distribution, quantum communications, quantum computing, post-quantum cryptography, autonomous systems, advanced robotics, biotechnology, synthetic biology, computational biology, which I thought the media said that was a conspiracy theory, and e-commerce technology and services, including any electronic techniques for accomplishing business transactions, online retail, internet-enabled logistics, internet-enabled payment technology, and online marketplaces. In other words, everything. Note that this includes all e-commerce, all online banking transactions, payment systems, cryptocurrency, and so on. In effect, the Restrict Act is an attempt to seize total control over the entire online economy, online speech, and online freedom. It should really be called the Online Tyranny Act, as it is the manifestation of absolute tyranny over the American people. Now, the power-hungry tyrants in Washington, D.C. are not actually opposed to apps and software systems spying on you, by the way. After all, thanks to the Twitter files and other leaks, we now know that both the White House and the Department of Homeland Security quite literally ordered Facebook, Google, YouTube, Twitter, and other online platforms to censor a long list of websites and individuals who question COVID vaccine safety. The tyrants in Washington absolutely want to spy on the American people and censor all speech they don't like. They're doing it now. They aren't opposed to TikTok spying on the American people. They just want to be the ones in charge of the spying and the censorship. It was a moment of peak hypocrisy in the U.S. House hearing recently when U.S. members of Congress grilled the TikTok CEO about being engaged in the suppression of free speech of Chinese citizens while seeming to be utterly tone-deaf to the U.S. government's ongoing censorship of the American people. It's almost as if U.S. lawmakers have no idea that the U.S. empire censors the American people in exactly the same way Communist China censors its own people. With the Restrict Act, the U.S. government wants to monopolize censorship and surveillance power in its own hands. This isn't about ending censorship, it's about expanding it to cover all websites, services, and apps. The Restrict Act also invokes the broad definition of, quote, election interference to justify literally any action the government wants to take against a publisher or platform it dislikes. These actions can include seizing bank accounts, seizing domain names, seizing servers, and so on. And such tyrannical actions could be unleashed against an individual for doing nothing more than sharing a simple meme related to elections. Case in point, meme maker Douglas Mackey was just found guilty of serious felony election interference for a funny meme he distributed about Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. The DOJ prosecuted Mackey over the meme and was easily able to convince a jury of brainwashed liberals to convict Mackey for the very same kind of meme joke that Democrats routinely distribute against Trump and others. But through selective prosecution, Mackey is now facing 10 years in prison. This is the kind of weaponization of the legal system, a form of government terrorism against the people, that would be escalated by a factor of 1,000 under the Restrict Act. The act would target anyone who merely criticized a Democrat candidate or who posted something about the candidate which the regime in power says isn't true. While the Restrict Act claims to prevent China from spying on Americans, it actually transforms America into Communist China by erecting a massive surveillance and censorship police state over all Americans. The Act specifically names all the networks that the government can use for spying on citizens. Wireless local area networks, mobile networks, satellite payloads, satellite operations and control, cable access points, wireline access points, core networking systems, long-haul, short-haul, and backhaul networks, or edge computer platforms. The Act also grants the government the power to target entire online platforms, including domain names, cloud computing, databases, CDNs as content delivery networks, and more. The tyranny encompasses literally every known computing and e-commerce ecosystem that exists, including gaming. The Act specifically names desktop applications, mobile applications, gaming applications, payment applications, or web-based applications. This means there's no website, application, transaction, software, or service that isn't threatened by the Restrict Act. Furthermore, the Act specifically grants the government the power to sabotage by any means necessary any person, organization, software system, website, platform, or anything else they deem to be unacceptable. If the regime decides they don't like what you are publishing or doing, in other words, they can simply seize it, shut it down, confiscate all your assets, and silence you utterly without any due process or opportunity for legal defense. This is tyranny on steroids. If enacted, it would mean the end of the Republic and the end of human freedom for Western civilization. Truth will become treason in a nation of lies. To help defeat the Restrict Act, I urge you, contact your representatives and demand they reject the Restrict Act. Call them now, and also call your state attorney general and share the warning about the danger of this overzealous, authoritarian, fascist law that seeks to end the First Amendment and criminalize free speech in America. We must defeat the Restrict Act. And then, in the next election, we must defeat each and every tyrant that supported it. And to anyone who foolishly says that this act is only intended to be used against the communist Chinese and would never be weaponized against the American people, just look at the Patriot Act and how it was originally promoted to surveil radical Islamic extremists, but now it's used every day to illegally silence and surveil the American people. All new powers granted to the government are eventually weaponized against the people. The Restrict Act is a weapon against freedom, and if passed, it will be used to silence, oppress, and imprison millions of Americans who oppose tyranny, censorship, rigged elections, and mandatory vaccines. Take action now to defeat this outrageously dangerous piece of legislation. And God bless America. Thank you for listening. I'm Mike Adams, the Health Ranger of naturalnews.com and the founder of Brighteon.com.
As trust in institutions continues to decline, countries around the world are rushing to control the flow of information before their citizens completely lose confidence in their governments. Over the last 2 years, many governments have proposed bills which would result in an unprecedented amount of online censorship. In some countries, these bills have already been passed. Now, I want to start with Canada, because its online censorship bill seems to be the most dystopian of them all. Canada's online censorship bill is titled Bill C-11, also known as the Online Streaming Act. As explained in the blog post, Bill C-11 would effectively give the Canadian Radio, Television and Telecommunications Commission, or CRTC, the power to decide exactly what content Canadians can see on YouTube and other social media platforms. Note that the CRTC is part of the Canadian government. If that wasn't scary enough, a passage in the bill specifies that these regulations will apply to user-generated content. Besides controlling the amount and type of advertising that would appear on the videos of YouTubers, the CRTC would have the power to dictate what content they make. Basically, if the content does not contain sufficient diversity and inclusion of different ethnicities, languages, and so on, then the content can't be seen by Canadians. Naturally, the definition of these diversity and inclusion criteria would be up to the CRTC to decide. They would also have the power to designate any YouTuber as a so-called broadcaster. Being designated as a broadcaster means comply with the CRTC's criteria or else be blocked in the country. Not only that, but some broadcasters will also be required to contribute to the Canada Media Fund, which is of course used to fund mainstream media in Canada. Now this is significant because most of the Canadian media is funded directly or indirectly by the Canadian government via the Canada Media Fund and other avenues. Mandatory contribution by broadcasters would double the size of the Canada Media Fund, further increasing government control of the media. If that didn't make it clear enough, it appears that the Canadian government is desperate to ensure that it continues to control the narrative in the country. This makes sense considering that trust in the government has been falling for years and has fallen off a cliff since the pandemic began. To put things into perspective, 40% of Canadians trusted their government at the beginning of the pandemic. Today, this figure stands at 20%, a more than 50% drop. As you'll soon see, a similarly large drop in government trust has occurred in other countries, but the motivations for censorship vary. As for Bill C-11, it's currently sitting with the Canadian Senate, which will vote on the bill in February. This suggests that Bill C-11 has a high likelihood of becoming law in Canada, and this could occur in just a few months' time. If this happens, then the internet in Canada will be completely different from the rest of the world, with content curated entirely by the Canadian government, much like it is in North Korea. I suppose such an outcome wouldn't be that surprising given how the Canadian government handled the pandemic. Never mind that many Canadian politicians are part of the World Economic Forum, or WEF, including the Prime Minister. I'm not religious, folks, but I'm honestly thanking God for decentralized social media right now.
There's a new law that's being tested out in Ireland where they can kick in your door and come and arrest you for things that you're reading and thinking about. Take a look at this.
The Minister for Justice is to strengthen the law against hate crimes and hate speech with the aim of making it easier to secure convictions in the courts.
Even to be in possession of material without even sharing it. Anybody can get a knock on the door, a warrant from the Gardaí, they can come in, search my home, search everybody that's in my home, take all their devices, take all our computers, take any material that is relevant to them that they see to be relevant to the case.
Well, this bill, this hate bill in Ireland has just passed the lower house and is moving its way into the Senate, and many believe it's going to pass there. And I'm joined now by David Thunder, who's been doing a lot of writing and reporting on this very bill and the problems around it. David, first of all, is this a brand new bill, or is this, an adjustment to something that's already existed? What exactly is happening here?
This bill, thank you for having me on. This bill is essentially an update of the 1989 Incitement to Hatred Act. So, in fact, there has already been hate speech legislation on the books in Ireland for a long time, for many years. And what this bill does is it expands the categories of protected characteristics to include things like gender. The gender category is particularly interesting because the way they define gender here is the gender of a person, or the gender which a person expresses as the person's preferred gender, or with which the person identifies, and includes transgender and a gender other than those of male and female. So what on earth does this actually mean? It seems to mean whatever someone wants it to mean, essentially. If I identify with gender X or Y or Z, or I invent a new gender, then that becomes a protected category. So it's an extraordinary, radical redefinition of gender. And what worries me about this in particular is that it may have a chilling effect on speech, because if somebody, for example, wanted to question the agenda of the trans lobby, sure, if they just wanted to question whether or not, for example, trans men should participate in women's athletic contests, or whether or not children should receive trans therapy, hormone therapy, they could be branded as purveyors of hate speech, as inciting hate speech, and they could be prosecuted and put in jail for up to 5 years.
Now, in my reading of this, and if I'm stepping too far, let me know, but this isn't just things you're saying in public. If I have a friend that texts me, let's say, an article saying that, you know, transgender isn't real, or that this is a psychological problem, it's not a real manifestation. Or let's say I'm doing my own research for my child in my house and I have books that are laying out, you know, a differing perspective. I'm looking at different perspectives. Actually having literature that is not, you know, expressing the narrative that my government is supporting, that could be considered hate speech, could it not? And I can be arrested for that, for having those materials in my house?
Yes, there's one proviso, that is that they can, if they reasonably assume that you're preparing that text for publication. But the problem is that the burden of proof is on you to prove that you did not intend to publish it. So they've reversed the burden of proof and put it on the person who's being charged. So I now have to prove that I do not intend to publish something that's on my computer, if the prosecutor is assuming that it is intended for publication. A text that I have never published, that is sitting on my computer or on a piece of paper in my drawer, could be a ground for prosecution and for imprisonment. That's extraordinary, an extraordinary attack on the private sphere, on the right of freedom of expression, even of freedom of thought, because the thoughts that are on my laptop are essentially my thoughts. And the idea that somebody could arrest me because of this is extraordinary. It's truly extraordinary and quite shocking.
The problem with this word hate is I don't think any reasonable, decent human being, you know, believes in hate or allowing for hate. But what is the definition of hate when it comes to this law? How well defined is that term?
This law does not define hate in any place. It simply says that it defines as a crime a speech act, a public speech act or behavior that would be likely to incite hatred or violence against a group. It never defines what hatred is. And the flaw in this act is a flaw that we find in all hate speech legislation all over the world, which is essentially that it makes me, the speaker, criminally liable for the emotional effect of my words on my listeners. If they feel in their heart some kind of hatred towards one of these protected groups as a result of what I've published, then suddenly I'm criminally liable for that feeling that's in their heart. And to be more precise, I'm criminally liable if a judge deems that my text would be likely to incite such a feeling. It's a very woolly kind of charge that I've incited hate, and it's extremely subjective. And there's really no way for a judge to objectively distinguish between hateful speech and reasonable discourse.
Right.
Why? Because all discourse that is polemical and is controversial and is vibrant is likely to incite strong feelings in listeners, and sometimes it will incite hateful feelings. But are we really suggesting that we should shut down any speech that could potentially, you know, cause a feeling of hatred in someone? You're basically saying we should shut down public speech in general, political speech.
Should this bill pass, will it change how you're approaching? Do you think this will change how you approach it, or will you stand your ground and take the risk to, what do you feel like your position is here?
My position is that I will speak the truth and I will defend the truth. And if the police want to come knocking on my door because of that, then so be it.
Well, it's nice to know someone that thinks I feel the same way. If we kowtow to this, if we hide in the corners, then there'll be no one left to stand up for anybody.
Hi, good afternoon. I just thought I'd pop on to go through one of the sections of the Criminal Justice Incitement to Hate or Hatred and Hate Offences Bill 2022. And I'm going to cover now today Section 15 of that bill. And this basically allows the Gardaí to get a search warrant from the courts if they think that you have any material on any of your devices, any saved tweets, any videos, any memes, anything that could be possibly considered to incite violence and hatred against someone. Even if you've never intended to use that, even if no one else has seen it, once you have it, they can raid your house, take all your devices, phones, laptops, hard drives. They can take non-electronic devices too, your documents, personal diaries, books, but not just from you, but from every single member of your family as well. All devices in the house. If you're sharing in a flat, every single person within the flat or within the apartment will be their device will be seized. Not only that, they can then sit you down at your computer and force you to log in and force you to unlock your phone and to give up your passwords. And if you don't do that, they can throw you in jail for a year or fine you up to €5,000. And this is what the government is going to be voting through the Shannon in a few weeks' time. Unbelievable. So I would urge you to contact your senators to try and see if we can change and amend this legislation because it has a really chilling effect on free speech in this country. Thank you.
I can assure you we've done a pretty comprehensive global analysis of various attempts to restrict freedom of speech, and Ireland is far ahead with a very draconian proposal.
But she obviously, Pauline O'Reilly from the Green Party, suggested that the people need to be protected from feeling unsafe or discomfort.
Yeah, I should say they're unable to defend it using reason or evidence. I mean, it's absurd. I mean, the law would allow the police to go into people's homes unannounced, search your phones and computers, declare you guilty until proven innocent. It's basically a complete reversal of free speech and Enlightenment standards of justice that have been in place for hundreds of years. Honestly, it's something that the only comparison might be to the Spanish Inquisition or to some of the most totalitarian policies ever implemented. Never in human history have vulnerable populations been served by censorship. Censorship has only served to victimize people. When you look at movements for human liberation across history, they are always accompanied by the demand that they have a right to to represent their voice in public, and the people demanding censorship are never on the right side of history. They're never the good guys. They always say that they're doing so in order to protect some vulnerable group. So what you see here is nothing different from past totalitarian efforts. It's absolutely Orwellian. Vulnerable people need free speech. They don't need censorship.
And not from the Minister for Justice. She's saying we're not going to censor opinions. Well, it'll be up to a judge to decide that. The problem is the chilling effect. And the chilling effect is that people don't actually know if what they say could be prosecutable. Therefore, they will resist actually printing it or typing it or saying it.
Well, and hold on a second. I mean, who is she to decide what other people should be allowed to say? Who is she to say what the people of Ireland should be allowed to say or read or write? Free speech is a fundamental human right. You're not a full human being if you are not allowed to express your views. And here she is going around saying, oh no, I will allow that. No, it's not up to her to allow it. Neither she nor a judge should be up to them to allow it. It's absolutely not acceptable to do what she's doing. The whole world is watching her. After I tweeted about it, it went absolutely viral, and you can see that there were 10 times more responses to her, over 95% of which were negative on her proposal. She claimed that the public supports her proposal. The journalist Ben Scallon counted 3,500 comments made in the public comment period, and 73% of them were negative on her proposal. So she's complaining about misinformation. She's the source of misinformation. She says that this public supports her legislation. The public does not support her legislation. Therefore, she is spreading misinformation and under her own criteria should be censored. She claims that she should be able to censor hateful speech. She's engaging in hateful speech. She's expressing hatred towards people who have views that she doesn't like. I mean, she wants to arrest and criminalize people for the things they say and for the things on their telephones and computers. I can't think of a more hateful thing than that. They are very hateful themselves of minority views, of dissident views, of disfavored views. Why else would they be trying to shut people up? I think this has to be understood as a kind of panic by the elites that they don't control social media. I think there's been a panic around Brexit. Censorship is what they demand when their propaganda stops working. And I think people are waking up around the world to this. I think that the elites are panicking about it. I think that's why they want censorship. They're full of anger and rage that they can't control what we say. The only logical position is the one held by Voltaire, which is that I may disagree with you, but I will defend to the death your right to express yourself. That's the only civilized position on free speech. These issues have been debated hundreds of years ago. We've already, Western societies have already decided there are views on free speech. The fact that we even have to have this conversation is absolutely appalling.
This is really not law at all, Patrick. It's very important to stress this. It's what's called lawfare. Really a kind of such a loose formulation of legalities and definitions that it could mean anything. And therefore, that what actually, the way it works is that it intimidates by being so broad that everybody becomes intimidated to the point that they leave certain subjects alone. In a certain sense, they don't even need to take you to court because the process is enough to silence you. I mean, some of the stuff in it, Patrick, is beyond belief. You know, like there's talk about, for example, that it's not just your words that will be taken into account in the court, but your behavior. And I want to just read you a paragraph here, very short. For the purpose of this part, a person's behavior shall include behavior of any kind, and in particular things that the person says or otherwise communicates, as well as things that the person does. And such behavior may consist of a single act or a course of conduct. Now, what's that? That could be like a smirk. It could be like an upturned nose. It could be a kind of, a grin. Who knows? And they will have the ability and the capacity to drag you before the courts. And you may end up before a judge who's equally or more ideological, because he can interpret or she can interpret the legislation in whatever way he or she. It is entirely subjective. So essentially, it is a totalitarian instrument in the precise and ultimate meaning of that term, in its attempt to close down not just the speech, but actually the thought. It's trying to turn off thought at source so that it doesn't even get to the root of the tongue. This is like the level we have reached. You see, that's another aspect of it, like that. It's something that will happen to a high degree between the people themselves, or it'll be like COVID in that sense, where the people will be persecuting each other and policing each other, watching each other, spying. Even your own. Even to have a dinner party in your own home with people you don't intimately know and inside out would be quite a risky thing. If you were to say something untoward or potentially interpretable as untoward, this could be reported, and this person could stand as witness against you, and you could be convicted on that. It's beyond belief. I hope I'm conveying my sense of absolute shock and horror that I'm not even having to say these things. I can't believe it. I mean, I live in this country all my life. I cannot believe that these things are happening now.
it puts a chill on, if it puts a chill on dissent, this is a big problem, because culture is often downstream from dissent. Dissident literature, dissident poetry, dissident films, dissident books, dissident journalism. That this becomes the culture of a society, of a country, and a good a free society will allow a certain level of provocation in speech and discourse, because that's what it takes to shake the system enough for people to get out of their sort of calcified positions. I want to play you a clip. You're probably familiar with this clip. It's from a recent press conference given by the Taoiseach, Leo Varadkar. And they held a public consultation for this legislation. And this was in March of 2022. And when they polled the public about do they like this type of legislation, only 19% said yes. So it was 80% no, don't like it. And so that's a pretty definitive poll there. And then the vote in the lower house was 110 for, 14 against the legislation. So a total inversion of public opinion. And here's your Taoiseach. Listen to this clip and we'll discuss this. Here it is.
Taoiseach, your government conducted a public consultation regarding hate speech laws where citizens were asked to give their thoughts on the issue, and out of the thousands of responses from private individuals, over 70% were not supportive of such laws, and yet you're proceeding with them anyway. So my question is, why did your government bother to do a public consultation if you were just going to ignore the results?
Well, we do public consultations because we think they're good practice. It's a way to find out what people's thoughts are on issues, and it's also a way to flesh out and highlight some of the issues that we may not have considered. But we're also wise to the fact that the vast majority of people don't make submissions to public consultations. We have to bear that in mind. It's only a small portion of the population that participate in these things, so it's not necessarily reflective of public opinion. And also we're wise to the fact that very often submissions are organised, and campaign groups will organise responses, so we're clear with that too.
But why hold the consultation if the end result is just going to be disregarded on the basis that it's not representative of public opinion? What's the point of it then?
Well, the point is that we're a democracy, and in Ireland we have elections, and decisions are made by the government and the elected parliament. They're not made on foot of public consultations or opinion polls. That's not what they're about. They're about testing the temperature.
So is it just for show then?
No.
Wow. What do you...
Yeah, well, it's impossible to even answer that. I mean, it's impossible. You're just gobsmacked in the face of that series of self-contradictions in that tirade. That clip you played is really telling in that respect. It reflects, I think, what I say, that this guy who's supposed to be the leader of the Irish government doesn't give two figs for the Irish people. He's laughing at them. He's sneering at them, saying, well, yeah, we consult you just for the fun, just so we can go against what you want.
Clearly holding the public in total contempt. It's obvious. Basically, we know best.
Exactly.
We'll decide.
Exactly
for you.
right.
Yeah. These are extraordinary times, John, and these issues are so important, and they're not just it's not just Irish issues, ladies and gentlemen. This applies to everybody. If you're in Western civilization, you need to get dialed in on this sort of thing right now, because chances are it's happening in your backyard, whether you know it or not.
Today's discussion will continue a series of shows here on the Freeman Report looking at the state of free speech and the threats to its survival that are appearing on the horizon. Last week, I had CJ Hopkins on the show, who has received a criminal charge and a punishment of €3,600 or 60 days in jail, all for the heinous crime of criticising the German health minister on COVID policies via 2 posts on social media and having a swastika imprinted on a COVID mask on the front of his new book titled The Rise of the New Normal Reich. For this crime, CJ has been charged with furthering the interests of the Nazi cause, which is ironic because he used Nazi references in a negative context to draw parallels with recent events. The real irony, though, is that the method of free speech suppression that the German state is now using against him is exactly the type of tool that the Nazis used to suppress free speech that laid the foundations for the terrible things that happened in the 1940s. Now, as I discussed on last week's show with CJ Hopkins, the accumulation of evidence from the past 3 years suggests we are now seeing a trend that is heading in one direction, a direction of travel very similar to what we saw in 1930s Germany. The atrocities didn't happen overnight. The groundwork needed to prepare for that whole nation to allow these things to happen. That did not happen overnight. Now, the first step in the current attack on free speech has been to create a narrative that we have a problem, that the internet has created a Wild West situation where anyone can say anything, and that this poses a threat to our democracy and society. The two common threats they keep on coming back to is the integrity of elections and information that threatens public health. But the irony is, of course, that while they point to these threats, in reality, it is in fact they that are the real threat to elections and to our health. Very Orwellian indeed, and extremely worrying, because the reason they want to suppress free speech is not to protect us, but instead to take away our main defense against them. Free speech is our defense against their tyrannical machinations, because as they know full well, we are the many and they are the few. They fear us. They fear our power, they fear our numbers. And so they fear us being able to share information about what is really happening and what they're really up to. They fear being exposed and being identified because they, whoever they are, work in the shadows. People like Bill Gates, Anthony Fauci, and Joe Biden are the bogeymen. They are not the people behind the scenes pulling the levers. Nope. They are the sacrificial lambs. So in order to deliver their plans for the world that keep them safe in their castle, while us peasants fight for the scraps, to do this, they must first of all stop us talking with each other and sharing information and intelligence.
Welcome to the Gray Zone. I'm Max Blumenthal, and I'm going to be talking today to a true dissident who is living in Berlin, Germany. His name is CJ Hopkins. He is the author of a book that is effectively banned in Germany, and he's now being prosecuted for the cover of that book. He's also being prosecuted for a tweet where he is accused of insulting the German version of Anthony Fauci, Karl Lauterbach. And CJ has actually been found guilty by a German court of thought crimes and faces 60 days in prison or a 3,600 euro fine. This is the cover of CJ Hopkins' book, The Rise of the New Normal Reich. And I was proud to blurb this book. Now, here's the part in question. You can barely see this, but it's a swastika inside a mask, which he has portrayed as a symbol of mask compliance. And he has been found guilty for the cover of that book in Germany. So to discuss this situation, we're joined by CJ Hopkins now. CJ, great to see you. Welcome back.
Thanks for having me back, Max. I appreciate it.
So I guess just to describe what happened
Yeah, let me just try to be clear about it a little bit. You described it pretty well. What happened is in June, I got a letter from the Berlin state prosecutor notifying me that I was under criminal investigation for 2 tweets. Those are the actual charges. Is 2 tweets, and so I got a German lawyer, and the lawyer responded to the state prosecutor. First of all, just asked them, what are the tweets? Because they didn't even tell us what the tweets were originally. And then it turned out the 2 tweets were exactly what you said. It's the cover art of my book that I used in 2 tweets. In the first tweet, there was a campaign in Germany on Twitter going around at the time. It was when they were considering ending the mask mandates. And there was a fanatical campaign going on. In English, it's basically people saying the masks stay on, and they were trying to whip up support to continue the mandates. And so I tweeted the cover art of the book, and I wrote in German, but in English it was basically I said, yeah, the masks are ideological conformity symbols, and that's all they are. That's all they've ever been. Stop pretending that they're anything else, or get used to wearing them. And the second tweet was this tweet. You've got it up on the screen. Karl Lauterbach, our health minister, gave one of his many interviews to Die Welt, and they quoted him, "The masks always send a signal out." And I saw that and I thought, yeah, that's exactly my point. That's what they're for. That's what they do. So I threw my cover art from the book on that again and just quoted him and put the date on it, as you can see. And so those are my hate crimes. For that I am charged with, and this is a quote, disseminating propaganda, the intention of which is to further the aims of a former National Socialist organization. End quote. So basically, I'm charged for these 2 tweets. I'm charged with, supporting and furthering the cause of the Nazis. That was in June. The next thing I know, a week, 10 days ago, we get what in German it's a Strafbefehl. In English, it translates as an order of punishment. So basically, that's advising me that I'm going to be punished for these hate crimes. You said it, a fine of 3,600 euro or 60 days in jail. That's where we are. What comes next is that I go to some sort of Kafkaesque trial, where this trial will be in front of the judge that already issued the order of punishment. So you can imagine how that's going to go, and then there's a lengthy appeal process to follow. But we're allowed. There are several steps. We can go now in front of the same judge, and my lawyer can make the same arguments that he's already exhaustively made in writing in front of this judge, and presumably this judge is going to decide the same thing that he's already decided. And then I'll have to pay those court costs, and then we'll appeal that to the appeals court. The appeals court could overturn it. The appeals court could overturn the decision. And if they don't, we'll go past that. I met with my lawyer this week, and I'm committed to taking this process all the way through to the end. Some people are telling me it could end up in the Constitutional Court, which is basically the Supreme Court of Germany.
So the judge, the initial judge who found you guilty, rejected your free speech argument. On what grounds did the judge justify that rejection? Because to me and pretty much everyone watching this, it seems like in any society that declares itself a liberal democracy, this kind of speech should be protected.
And it is protected. Let me answer your question first. The judge cited no grounds, no explanation, nothing. Just here's the judgment, and this is going to be executed in 2 weeks unless you schedule this Kafkaesque trial. This law, a lot of people, I think, assume that, you know, swastikas are completely banned and outlawed and you can never display a swastika in Germany. And this is not true. Of course, if you're a Nazi and you're promoting Nazism, of course that's banned. You know, and even though I'm a free speech absolutist, I understand that. It's Germany, for God's sakes. But there are specifically exceptions written into the German law. There are exceptions for art. There are exceptions for satire. There are exceptions for educational purposes. And there are specifically exceptions for people who are protesting or countering anti-constitutional activity, which is exactly what, you know, I have just done for about 3 years. You know, all of the measures, all of the corona measures, all of the, you know, the abrogation of the Constitution and everything was all completely anti-constitutional. So there are very clear exceptions written into the German law to protect even what I did. You know, even what I did. So there are absolutely free speech protections in Germany, and the judge is ignoring them. The authorities are ignoring them. The thing that is alarming and absurd about this, Max, is that there's not even there's absolutely no plausible logical argument for these charges. You know, it takes about, if you didn't know me from Adam, it would take you about 2 minutes, you know, to research my, you know, 30-year history of work on the stage and in publications and determine what my character is and what my intentions are. It did take about 2 minutes. And these people aren't idiots. You know, they know who I am. My attorney has explained all of this to them. Yeah. This is intimidation and it's retribution. And I think it is part of the larger, broader crackdown on dissent that is happening everywhere. I just saw the Gray Zone's fundraising campaign just got you know, canceled and taken down. You know, the DSA just went through into effect here. Ireland is ramming you know, an incredibly authoritarian speech bill through. It's happening in the UK. I think my case is just one, you know, of many examples of this crackdown on dissent.
Yeah, and we've talked to Heinrich Booker of the Anti-War Co-op Cafe, who's been prosecuted for bringing up Germany's support for Ukrainian Nazi battalions like the Azov Battalion. We've spoken to Alina Lipp, who's been prosecuted by the German state simply for reporting from the wrong side of the war, from the pro-Russian separatist areas of the Donbass. She's had her bank accounts seized and cannot return to Germany. So this is part of a larger trend. We're going to talk about Ireland and the DSA as well. And yes, GoFundMe has not banned us or taken us down. What they've done is they've frozen all donations on the grounds of some external concerns, and they don't offer us any due process. So at least you're given the illusion of due process. And what we have to do is now go to everyone and ask them to ask for a refund and then set up a separate fundraiser. It's this neoliberal model where the privately owned corporations are covertly influenced and controlled by the state. And we have no, it's an end around free, it's a way of getting around free speech protection. So that's, do you feel that this society has ejected you? Are you planning to leave? Or are you going to, you know, make your stand?
Yes, and I'll admit this to all of the people. You know, for years people have been writing to me, you know, and replying to tweets and stuff, and basically saying, you know, you idiot, what are you still doing there? You know, yeah. What kind of a moron are you? Get out of Germany, get out now. And I've been pushing back to those people and trying to tell them, hey, you know, I've lived here for almost 20 years. I'm dug in. My wife has a business here. I'm not rich. I can't just, you know, pick up my life and move. And also, I don't like being bullied. I don't like being, you know, pushed out of some place that I've set up as home. And I've been saying this to people for years and years. And I just want to say to those people, okay, I got it. I'm going. It's I can't just pick up and move, Max. It's going to take me a while. But the long story short, I had a long talk with my wife about this the other night, and where I ended up with, I said, you know, baby, what it comes down to is that if I stay here, I will not be able to respect myself. Is what it is. I mean, a country and a society that has gone this far, in our day and age, and is willing to dish out this type of treatment, to someone like me in this absurd situation. I can't stay here and respect myself. So I'm making plans and figuring out how to make that transition. It's going to take a while. It's not going to happen overnight. But yes, I'm gone. I'm going to fight this as far as I can go with it, and I'll definitely stay for that. But once the dust has settled for this, I just turned 62 years old. I don't want to get old and die here.
Well, I understand. So how are you experiencing the new normal now in Germany? And explain what you meant by the new normal Reich.
The title of my book, The Rise of the New Normal Reich, does not refer to Germany alone. If you read the book and you look at my essays, I covered all of this from the very beginning in March of 2020. I covered events in the USA. I covered events in the UK, Canada, Australia. That title is not a reference to Germany. The new normal Reich is a global Reich, if I want to stay with the metaphor.
And it just means regime. I mean, you're using
it just means empire. Yeah, it just means empire. It's another word for empire, imperium or Reich. You asked me about the new normal and where we are now. We're in a different phase. Max, I described what happened during 2020 to 2022. I described that as the shock and awe phase, right? And the shock and awe phase is over. That's people may remember this from the U.S. invasion of Iraq. It's when you go in and blow the hell out of everything and scare everybody to death and take over the country. The shock and awe phase is over. I think the phase that we're in now, I've been describing it as the mistakes were made phase. And it's also the limited hangout phase. And if people go back and look at the aftermath of the U.S. invasion of Iraq, these are classic stages. This is where the powers that be kind of process everything that happened, and they admit to small things so that they don't have to talk about large things. And they say, oh yeah, well, we weren't exactly right about this. But it ends up just reinforcing the whole official narrative that by this time has been planted and locked in to society. So I think we're in that phase. It's a different phase. It's a subtler phase. And what I'm seeing is just all of the classic hallmarks of this phase. The official pandemic narrative is being enshrined as official history. With minor
revisionist history.
Yes.
I mean, Fauci has said, I never called for anyone to be locked down, just a straight up lie. Bill Gates has said something similar, that, the lockdowns were, we were going to need better lockdowns. And he also said, we're going to need better vaccines, when at the time they were saying this is like the gold standard. Karl Lauterbach also, here's a tweet by Karl Lauterbach at the time. And he's attacking a minority of society that does not want a vaccination without side effects, even though it is free and can save their lives. He's basically saying it is without side effects. And then Karl Lauterbach later had to acknowledge hundreds of thousands of reported vaccine injuries in his health ministry system this March. So, and it's like everyone's just forgotten, and he's not held accountable. And that is what really shocks me. Isn't just that the officials of the new normal who guided this regime are squirming out of their previous statements, which created so much public consent for disastrous policies, but that the public is willing to let them squirm away. I want to play an exchange that took place, I think, in the Irish Parliament about Ireland's new laws on misinformation and hate speech, which are very vague. And here you have the media minister of Ireland being challenged by the press about what constitutes misinformation. And I want to get your reaction to this, because I assume, you know, you're basically being accused of the same thing.
The EU Digital Services Act came into effect, which will attempt to regulate so-called misinformation on social media platforms, and your own government's electoral commission will fulfill a similar role nationally. So is it not dangerous for democracy that powerful state institutions will get to decide what is and isn't true?
I think this is actually a very important development for Ireland. So while the European Commission, you know, leads on implementation and enforcement, you know, provides the member states to establishment, you know, to share responsibility depending on the circumstances of any particular situation. I think what we've done with Comisiún Naman and setting that up as a regulator will protect children. Mostly, that's the priority, children from harmful content online, and I welcome this today.
Sure, but I'm asking about the misinformation side of it specifically. Whatever about child protection, that's a whole separate issue. I mean, is it right for government and state institutions to be able to say what is and isn't true?
Look, we have, when it comes to misinformation, it's actually, it would point to the whole value of public service broadcasting and why we need reliable information. And I think under the DSA, you'll see that every state will designate a body to the DSC, and we have that person, that was John Evans, was appointed as our Digital Services Commissioner in on Comisiún, and I welcome the development.
But I'm sorry, that's not an answer to the question. I'm asking you, do you think it's right and healthy for democracy for the government and the state to be able to decide what is and isn't true? Have you done any assessments, for example, to make sure that these regulations aren't abused or overused?
I think everything that we see in misinformation, anything that can prevent misinformation, is to be welcomed.
So you haven't done any assessment then to ensure that this isn't abused?
The DSA would lie with Minister Coveney's department, but Comisiún Naman lies with me.
Minister, in relation...
Minister, just on the Digital Services Act again, is it really good enough that you failed to answer the question earlier about whether or not it's acceptable for the state to regulate information that people are allowed to say and decide what is true or false? Should people be encouraged by the fact that the minister can't answer a simple question when we're literally regulating truth itself?
I'm quite clear on the need to tackle misinformation, and actually everything that we're dealing with now points to the value of public service broadcasting and the immense valuable role it played during, for example, the pandemic.
None of this has anything to do with the question I've asked.
So that was interesting how she brought up the role of public broadcasting during the pandemic at the end.
I've seen that. I saw that. I'm actually connected to that journalist who grilled her. So I had seen that clip before, and it's remarkable. The journalist was pressing the minister and saying, "Will you answer the question?" And basically, if you cut through all of the doublespeak, her answer was, "Screw you." Screw you. We don't have to explain ourselves to you anymore. What we're going to do, we have these words, these terms, and we're going to use these terms to justify controlling speech however we want to.
Right.
And we could talk about the DSA for 2 hours and the Irish bill for 2 hours, the UK bill for 2 hours, but that is essentially what this comes down to. It's happening in countries throughout the West, and it is essentially, basically the powers that be decided, wow, we need to shut this down. We need to establish some controls over what people can read and see and say on the internet, and we're going to push all these bills through and all these laws through to legitimize what we want to do. This is the broader crackdown on dissent that I'm talking about, and if people aren't paying attention to it, they really, really need to.
And it's sort of justified through the mass hysteria that comes about through a psychological operation that generates that generate fear and hysteria among the public to nudge the public into a certain behavior, whether it's displaying nationalism and support for a war effort like the NATO proxy war in Ukraine, or for mandates of the jab mandates, the mask mandates, and total compliance around COVID. And you wrote so trenchantly about the mask conformity during the COVID event, which was brought about through fear, through just outright lying by officials like Karl Lauterbach. What do you see? Do you see anything on the horizon, another event that could accelerate this process of de-democratization and corporate state control over speech?
I do, and I want to avoid getting into a long digression with my usual stuff that my usual shtick that and people can read online. But the short version is I've been tracking this evolution since way before 2020, way back to Brexit and Trump and the whole rise of the populist pushback against the hegemony of global capitalist ideology. I've been tracking it, and I see this as one movement that has been evolving. There's a line that runs through all this, and what it's all about is we don't have to really do democracy anymore like we used to, right? We control the entire planet. When I say we, and that's where it gets complicated, and I don't want to get bogged down in it, people can read about it. I'm talking about a global ideological system that is very complex, but nonetheless, it's a global capitalist world, folks. One big global capitalist world. They don't have any outside adversaries on that ultimate level. There's no ideological adversary to global capitalism. When I say global cap, I'm talking about China and Russia, just like every other country on the planet. There's no outside adversary anymore. The only thing that this system has left to do is clear and hold, tighten control, identify pockets of resistance, any type of resistance, whether it is Russia trying to hold on to its national sovereignty, Iran trying to hold on to its national sovereignty, or right-wing populism rising up in Europe, or people rebelling to the COVID measures. It doesn't matter what type of resistance. Identify pockets of resistance, wipe out those pockets of resistance, and establish global Gleichschaltung, ideological conformity. And if you remember the Biden insurrection, no one was allowed to attend. You live in DC, you know this. The entire city was, locked down, soldiers in the streets, fences everywhere. And instead of allowing people to come to the inauguration, they had a field of flags.
Yeah.
They planted a field of, if you go back and look at that inauguration, I wrote about it, the message they were sending was incredibly clear. We've killed Donald Trump. Here's his head. We're going to put it on a spike outside the castle so everyone can see it, right? We're going to inaugurate Joe Biden, who can hardly get through 3 or 4 sentences. We're not going to let anybody come to the inauguration. We're going to shut everything down. We're going to occupy the city with soldiers. Are you folks getting the message? It's like, we're in charge.
And if you resist, we'll call you QAnon.
Absolutely. We'll call you QAnon. We'll call you all sorts of names. And hey, maybe we'll charge you with ridiculous, fictitious crimes if you're loud enough. The message, what I say, Max, the message that the system is pumping out is we're not playing grab ass anymore. We're in charge. We want you to know that we're in charge. We're not following the old rules of democracy anymore. And if you rebel against us, if you push back against us, we will crush you. We will crush you. And guess what? Most people, we've scared them. We've terrified them into a state that they will applaud while we crush you. Right? That's the message that I'm getting. So, and when you are a global power system that does not have any external adversaries, any external ideological adversaries, you don't need an ideology anymore in the way that we understand ideology, right? Your ideology becomes reality. right? The totalitarianism that is developing now, I believe a new form of it is developing now. It is not 20th century totalitarianism. There are similarities, many differences. One of the key differences is this. Right? Instead of, it's not one ideology competing against another ideology. It's people like Naomi Klein saying, oh, what's wrong with these crazy, sick people who don't recognize reality? In other words, the system has taken upon itself the authority to dictate what is real. Not just what is true, but what is real.
Yep.
And anyone who contradicts them, anyone who contradicts this narrative, we're not political opponents anymore. We are people who do not perceive reality correctly. And this is what I mean by pathologized totalitarianism. It is much more insidious. It erases politics. It erases the political nature of the conflict, and it turns us into deviants, into, abnormal, pathological deviants. And it is a feature. It's not an aberration that's happening by accident. You're not sure if people realize how dire the situation is. We're at a point where we're organizing to try to defend our fundamental democratic right to free speech. That's how dire the situation is, folks, is this basic fundamental right, which is the foundation of all of our other rights, is under serious threat. It is under attack. And if I can just urge people, I'm talking about people who people who hate my guts, who think that I'm horrible and, think nasty things about Roger. You don't have to like me. Think about this principle, this fundamental democratic principle. If we allow this to be destroyed, then we've got nothing. All of our democratic rights, our other democratic rights, mean nothing if we're not free to express ourselves and to report things and to disagree with each other publicly. If we lose it, if this succeeds, we're really headed down a dark road. And I don't think most people are apprehending where we are and where we're headed yet. And I'm just urging people to pay attention and to look into this stuff, regardless of whether you think I'm a COVID denier or a conspiracy theorist or whatever. Forget about me. Look into this stuff yourself. Look at these bills. Look at the repression of free speech that's being carried out. And think about that. Think about it. Are you willing to lose this fundamental democratic right because somebody said something that offends you?
Well, many people might not understand how dangerous the situation is until it happens to them. And unless they're enthusiastically on the side of officialdom, it will.
Przypominamy, że na naszym kanale nie ma płatnych reklam i jeżeli uważasz, że robimy coś wartościowego, to możesz wesprzeć naszą pracę poprzez datek dowolnej wartości. Możesz też nas wspomóc, odwiedzając sklep partnerski KILLUMINATI, który oferuje odzież, literaturę dla wszystkich przebudzonych. Jest to świetna forma wyjścia z przekazem poza internet. Linki znajdziesz pod filmem. Pozdrawiamy, KILLUMINATI Team. Dodaj łapkę w górę i subskrybuj nasz kanał. Pozdrawiamy, KILLUMINATI Team.